Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert, and this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our future. Now, many people say that we are the lucky country. Most of us watching this, listening to this are in Australia. But will this continue? What will drive Australia's future prosperity? That's what I want to discuss with Simon Kuestenmacher today. Not only what's going to shape the future of our nation, but also some of the challenges we're going to be facing ahead. Australia's prosperity has long been intertwined with our ability to attract and integrate new migrants. That's obviously created a bit of controversy over the last couple of years. So there's probably more to the story than meets the eye. Simon, you recently wrote an article in the New Daily called Migration Drives Australia's Prosperity. And so I think this is going to be a really useful show for business owners, for investors, for somebody who's interested about our future. It's been a big topic, immigration, hasn't it?
It always is. To be honest, in every country, it's a big topic. So we are not that special in that sense. We are, however, special when we talk about migration because Australia well and truly is a migration nation. We've been built around migration. We've long taken in large numbers of migrants. We've done so to great avail, so to speak. We can, of course, do this because we are an attractive destination. If you play the game of finding the most attractive country in the world to migrate to, and you look at the top 10, it's impossible to kick Australia out of the top 10. We're always there as one of the most attractive destinations. We are a rich country. We are a safe country. We are a democracy. You have a nice and high GDP per capita. There are plenty of business opportunities out there. Some would argue we have a really nice climate. So these things all work in favor. We're even far away from the rest of the world, so this could be viewed as a positive, meaning who's going to invade Australia. There are no border conflicts in Australia. These things tend to work in the favor.
Also, migration has been what's grown our nation. But in your article, you also suggested it was a double-edged sword if not managed carefully. What are some of the risks we face if we don't plan our growth properly, Simon?
Well, if you grow too fast, you don't provide enough housing, and then it's always when you grow fast through either controlled population flows, which is our system, or uncontrolled population flows, which is happening in Europe when you have uncontrolled population flows across the Mediterranean, people get resentful. And that is, of course, pure poison for social cohesion. That must be avoided. You cannot have a country that is resenting basic elements of your strategy, so to speak. And in Australia, sometimes we pretend that we are not a migration nation, and that's dangerous. So we need to be open and honest about all types of challenges, and we also need to come up with some sort of an understanding of how much migration can we allow for in every given year in a way that we can actually integrate it into society in a successful way.
Well, I've heard you say that the size of a city, a town, a country isn't really as important as its ability to have a good lifestyle. So it's not really how many people come here, but maybe what roles they're going to play in the country and whether we can manage them with accommodation and infrastructure. So
exactly, and how those numbers stand in relation. You can run a wonderful city at 1 million people, or you can run a terrible city at 1 million people. So when people look at a city and say, oh, it's too full, we're already at 1 million people, at 5 million people, I was like, that's not true. The size of the city well and truly doesn't matter. As long as you build up decently and adequate infrastructure, you're fine. And so the argument would then be, well, do we either have too many migrants, which is a very common argument, or do we have a lack of infrastructure? So, of course, both could be true at the same time. But ultimately, I would say we failed catastrophically as a country to build adequate infrastructure and housing as we increased our migration numbers. Because the reason we increased migration was to counter the aging of society. And that's a universal problem across the developed world. You just get older and older, and then society, the whole economic system stops working. And so what Australia can do as a migration nation is we fill this gap of workers that we have by importing workers. It's pretty easy. So that allows us to age much slower. So sometimes people call this a migration Ponzi scheme. And what they mean by this is they say, yes, we allow migrants into the country, but these migrants are also humans, and they will then age as well, and they will then also contribute to aged care costs and so forth. It's like, yes, that's true. But what we are doing by aging our society much slower is that we have massive advantages compared to countries that are aging faster. And because if you're aging faster, you need to come up with a completely different business model. The current model does not work as if we're aging as a country like crazy. And we are at the moment, we're 20 years behind the aging of something like Germany, or 30 years behind Japan. And so that then allows us to carefully watch what the rest of the world is doing with their aging economies and try to copy paste the best solutions. And so sometimes people look at Japan and they say, look at Japan. They've minimized, they have almost no migration intake or very little migration intake, and they shrank their country's population for the last 30 years, and still they grew their GDP. Let's do that. Let's follow the Japanese model. That's a great idea. Unfortunately, it's utterly impossible in Australia because we run a completely different business model from what the Japanese do. The Japanese are a high-tech manufacturing country that can just take their factories there from Toyota to Sony, whatever it is, and build those factories overseas, utilize foreign labor overseas, and re-import the profits. A country like Australia that makes their money with mining, that needs to be taken place in the country, same with agriculture, same with tourism, same with international education. We cannot export our money-making schemes. We need workers in the country. So if we want to continue to grow our economy doing these same dumb tricks that we've done over the last decades, we need migrants. No other way around it.
Having said that, that's created a per capita recession. While talking about GDP, Australia hasn't fallen into a recession like some people predicted because of high interest rates slowing down our economy. They haven't done that sufficiently. But because there's more of us, if you space it out per person, we've had the longest run of per capita recession, so to speak. In other words, the average Australian is nowhere near as rich as they were a little while ago, other than the fact that their houses have gone up, but the economy is not growing as much as our populations.
Exactly. That's where the whole productivity issue comes in, and we do have a taxation issue there. The taxation issue is, are we capturing enough of the mining wealth that we create in this country? And many people would say no. The Australia Institute, a lefty think tank, made a pretty great report actually a couple of months ago about the gas money that we don't collect. So we give our gas, a very important commodity, away for essentially free. Not quite as dramatic, but very, very cheap. And that is insane. We should have Norwegian style model where we very much utilize our dirty mining wealth, so to speak, our polluting mining wealth, captured in a national sovereign wealth fund, utilize this wealth that is created to pay for Australia to become a zero emission country, for example, to then pay for our social services, that we actually redistribute wealth this way. We're not actually doing that. So that's a lost chance, and this is where politicians should be blamed.
Now, we recently did an episode that we started talking about the supermarket island that led to how the hollowing out of our middle class has been occurring. By the way, if you don't currently subscribe to this podcast and you like this information, please stop for a second, subscribe on whichever podcast player or YouTube you're watching this. But after we've had this chat, go back and have a listen to the show where Simon explained how we've become a U-shaped society with rich and not as many middle class. But where I was getting at before I got sidetracked on that, Simon, was the fact that we're importing a lot of people for more higher skilled jobs in our migration policy, highly skilled migrants. Is that the right way to do it? Is it enough at the moment, or should we change our policies?
Yeah, so the problem with the skilled migration approach is that we try to do it all at once, and so we end up doing nothing completely right. The idea is there are essentially three types of migrants, if you will. The first one I would consider international students. This is a commodity. We treat them purely as a commodity. We make good money of them. They pay an arm with a leg for the uni degree. They fill up our coffers. Cool. That makes up 42% of migrants. And then the rest is split across skilled migrants. And then I would throw all the other things after this into one bucket. These are family visas, your spouses. These are your humanitarian visas, your asylum seekers. So it's not all that much there. And the skilled element of our migration intake should be larger. So I'd say more skilled migrants. And then if you want to take more skilled migrants and you want to keep the number of migrants constant, you need to probably minimize the number of international students a bit. And you need to come up with stricter regulations about spouse and family visas, for example. Very tough discussion, though, to do this. But then you go, what type of skilled migrants? And this is what you were alluding at. Are we getting in the right skilled migrants? And yeah, so we ultimately favor at the moment more highly skilled migrants because of our taxation scheme. Australia collects most of its tax through income taxes. You get more higher income. 53% of our tax is income tax. So if you then take in an engineer who earns $200,000 a year, that is much more attractive than taking in a tradie who earns $100,000 a year, so to speak. And so therefore, we do not even fill the most urgent skills gaps, but we take the short-term sugar hit as an economy, and that's not smart. And we could, of course, avoid this in a sense, to at least to a degree, if we handed out more employee-sponsored visas, where we say, well, we want to have a geographical say as well. So 40% of the visas go to the regions. And then employers have to sponsor these visas in the regions. And then the rest goes to the big cities. But you see how it's very difficult to assign who goes to, because every single industry body, and I talk to in my presentations to all different industry bodies, everyone wants to lobby for their jobs to get on the skilled migration list. If I speak to the truck driving industry, they have a 30,000 workers shortage at the moment. And they know that this number of workers that they need is going to go up like crazy. So of course, they heavily push for more workers. Then I talk to the aged care people. They say we need to double the amount of aged care workers in the next 14 years. So they lobby for aged care workers. And so every other industry does the same. And so eventually we come up to a point where, you can't fill all the skills gaps through migration. We don't have enough. But we're not saying we fill all the truck skills shortages and let all the other people suffer. But so we help every job, every industry a tiny bit. And so therefore,
it sounds like you're really going to have to keep the migration levels high moving forward, Simon.
I would say so. The only way around this would be to either develop a completely different economic model where we need heaps fewer people to create wealth to make sure that people can age gracefully at the other end. If you are of the opinion that this can be done, I think you can argue against migration. But the argument against migration has so many things that need to happen first before we can allow to wean ourselves off migration, if you want to use those words. So that's challenging, I would argue. Also, you need to collect tax in a different way. We're now at a position where you can completely ignore any politician that talks about cutting migration intake, because ultimately the treasurer will not allow them to cut the migration intake, because they will not be able to write a budget if you cut migrants out of the system.
Well, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion about it this year being an election year. Migration has also been blamed on a number of other things. The housing affordability, it's not fair. Oh, before we get on to that, maybe just a thought about the taxation system that you were talking about. We are so dependent on income tax and company tax. I would think it would make sense to increase the GST. It may be political suicide, but it seems like a fairer system that people who use the system and people who somehow or other manage to work through the cash system or the black market system, increasing GST would be a good way of increasing government income.
And so you always go, if you take some sort of income away from government, you need to find it elsewhere. And so I think psychologically it would be very good if people were to keep a higher share of their income. If you minimize the income tax, we can't completely go away with it, but minimize it. Then you go, where do you then get the tax from? Do you tax consumption, GST? Do you tax wealth? Who knows? These are all options that could be there. But as a society, we need to find a way of saying that's what we want to do. And of course, we then have the issue of, as you said, if we tax consumption too much, illegal imports of things become more attractive. So we then create more problems than we solve, and there is no perfect solution. So it's not like there's this perfect solution out there and just some people are too dumb to find it. It's very much a give and take kind of narrative, and we make choices as a government, as a society, and then we need to live with them.
Now, I started to mention also, of course, that the large number of migrants are currently being blamed on the housing affordability issues that we're suffering. In fact, most migrants don't buy houses for the first 3 to 5 years. They rent. So I think it may be fairer to say they're part of the problem of very low vacancy rates, higher rents. But most migrants don't buy a house until they find where they want to settle down, put their kids in school, make sure they've got a good job. So I can see that being a strong force 3-5 years down the track as more migrants have settled into society.
Yeah, but unfortunately, every now and then it's an election year, so we talk about just cutting migration in order to make housing cheaper. And it'd be easy, and it sounds good at first when you first hear it. Take out 100,000 migrants. Take in fewer migrants, that means you need to have fewer homes to house those people. That should make housing cheaper. Sounds great. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear to be true, because we had this natural experiment during the pandemic where we actually saw negative migration. All the while, we saw the highest increase of house prices. Sure enough, low interest rates helped to create demand for housing, but ultimately, when you sell a house as an individual person, you don't need to sell it by next Tuesday. You have quite a bit of wiggle room when you sell your house. There are more people selling the house when the markets are high, fewer people sell the house when the markets are low. And the same is what developers are doing. They can time when they produce dwellings. We said it in previous podcasts, this is a low margin industry. Why wouldn't a developer decide, I'd rather develop my new greenfield area, my 500 homes there, when prices are high rather than prices are low? It makes perfect sense that this is how we act. And you take out 100,000 migrants, these developments occur, the impact on house prices is very little, if at all, and all the while, we create more problems by not having the income tax that we rely on as a state, and of course not having the workers that we rely on. So I would always argue in my reading that cutting migration at the moment in this current system creates more problems than it solves. But politically, it is wonderful because you can blame the housing affordability crisis on a non-voting cohort. Migrants, pretty cool. All the while you tick the box of having talked about housing affordability, that's also cool, and then you don't need to talk about all the ways where you as a government make housing more expensive, which is even better for a politician, because first home buyer grants, that drives up house prices. Not a single economist would argue against it. Super for housing, that drives up house prices. Stamp duty, that drives up house prices. If you were to get rid of stamp duty and tax property, land tax, that would make housing cheaper. It would, of course, annoy the 3/4 of your votership that live in a house that they own or have a mortgage on. And so it's political suicide, so you don't do it. But, so therefore I fear that we are utilizing the migration is only migration is driving up house prices. If we only were to cut migration, then finally our house prices are great again. I don't think that's happening. It would be wonderful to believe that and to see that slowing of net migration had a positive impact on everyone's housing affordability. I think it's too easy, to be honest, just to say that.
It's very simplistic, isn't it? You were right that during COVID, when we actually had negative migration, more people were leaving than coming in. House prices and rents went up, and also vacancy rates went down. That was partly because people started living on their own or just in couples rather than sharing. They didn't want to share as much with people. They wanted extra accommodation. That hasn't gone away, Simon. So one of the issues with housing affordability in my mind is the fact that there are now slightly fewer people per household. Doesn't sound like much, but over the last decade, it's dropped from, I think it was about 2.5 to 2.4 people per household. That doesn't sound like much, but it means we need 10% more accommodation just for the same population. And we're still now wanting our bigger houses, our Zoom rooms, our work from home gyms and things like that as well. So there's a number of factors that are staying around that are pushing up home values. It's not just immigration or the number of people.
Exactly, but it's as I said before, it's an easy narrative, and so we tend to just quickly go to the easy narrative.
Well, so given the fact that we are going to keep importing people for the reasons that you said, for our economy, to keep the jobs going, to keep the wheels of industry greased, to replace the retiring baby boomers, I can see this is going to create, and in your article you suggested it will create environmental and probably social challenges. Do you want to maybe just give us some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the environmental challenges are they're just as easy as they are not true and true at the same time. So you put more people into Australia, these people consume more resources, they produce more emissions. That's an argument that's an argument that says we should have fewer migrants rather than more migrants. So yes, it's true, but the only difference is they use Australian resources and pollute through emissions in Australia rather than in Malaysia, India, or Germany. Because this is not ultimately changing the total number of people, and the migrants that come here to consume at a high rate in Australia. We are a high consumption society. They would consume just as much stuff in their home country. So it is called global warming for a reason, because it is a global phenomenon. So you must not underestimate that. It's rather you want to slow down consumption if you want to make the environmental argument. I don't think that actually counts. The argument that I would be more concerned about is the social cohesion argument. And this is if you take in too many migrants too fast and you don't proactively integrate them into society, you create a two-tiered society where people don't communicate with each other, where they live parallel lives. And that's not ultimately what we want. And so people say, well, that's enough of a reason for me to be against migration. And look at this, it's failing. People don't have enough Australian friends or something like this. And I'd say, yeah, it's not really the test of a successful integration. Tends not to be the first generation immigrants. Most listeners, if they're in Australia, will live next to a Greek or Italian widow at this point. And she quite often did not integrate well into society. Quite often she had her small Greek or Italian community. Her English is close to non-existent, even after 70 years in the country, because she grew up in a bubble. But she is not the one that we are interested in from this social cohesion perspective. Her kids are the interesting facts. Did her kids learn to speak perfect English? Did her kids integrate into society? Are her kids involved into, inter-ethnic marriages, if you will? And they are. We've seen this with Greeks and Italians, and sometimes people then say, yes, but these were Greeks and Italians, these were white Christians, they integrated into society, but now we're taking in Indians and Chinese, they're not Christians, they're not white, so therefore this is now the end, the doom of Australia. I'd say, no, just remember the 70s when we took in Vietnamese.
Yes.
Large numbers, and we now have decent insights into the first and of course second generation of Vietnamese migrants, and the second generation integrated well into society. So I therefore would argue it's more likely than not that the Indian and Chinese migrants of the last decade and a half are well and truly going to manage that their own kids will be integrated into Australia as well.
That means we've got a good future ahead. Clearly shows migration is going to give us some incredible potential for growth, but it also is going to come with some challenges. Now, if you're in business, a government organisation, an institution, and you can see the depth of information Simon can bring, if you'd like Simon to speak to your organisation or your company and share his research, how you can better perform in the years ahead, if we can unveil some of the trends that are going to shape the future of your business, I'm going to leave in the link in the show note to the demographics group, and you can inquire about Simon's speaking services. I know you enjoy sharing these thoughts with individual companies and organizations, Simon. That's what you do all day.
That's it. That's exactly what I do. And it's always fun because the migration angle, for example, is just one of the many things we look at, is always viewed slightly different from industry to industry, from town to town, from region to region. And so we then need to make sure that we adjust all the data and the research and the interpretation to the specific need in question. But
Well, I know you have very, very detailed research. I've seen that. You're sharing an element of it here, but clearly you hone it into the particular industry you're talking to. And for our listeners in general, thank you for listening again or watching again. I hope this conversation shed some lights on the vital role migration is going to have in Australia. I think you get that both Simon and I believe it is important and it is going to continue. So let's hope that our politicians get it right. And if you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe to the Demographics Decoded podcast wherever you're watching or listening to this. And actually, why not share it with somebody else, especially if you enjoyed it? Hey, and if you didn't enjoy it, share it with somebody anyway. Why should you be the only one who's not happy? But in fact, the readership, the viewership, the listenership is increased tremendously. We've only been running this a couple of months, Simon, and I know wherever I go, people mention it, and I think you're getting that comment as well, that more and more people are getting benefit from our show.
It's very nice. Definitely, if you ever come across me at the supermarket or airport lounge, always make sure to say hi. I'm always happy to chat demographics any day of the year, any time of the day.
Well, if not, join us next week. Each week we present the Demographics Decoded podcast. Thanks, Simon.
Been a pleasure once again.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.